created a program called WebBot. Those familiar with WebBot and its inventor say Clif designed the program to predict future stock market trends. The Internet's powerful ability to disseminate and build upon vast amounts of global information has led some to a provocative belief that the Internet is a repository of our own psychic visions of the future. WebBot is our tool to decoding it. WebBot is a software application that automatically combs Internet data in search of keywords denoting trends. It not only finds the keywords, but those surrounding them, and analyzes the results using linguistic tools. The data ends up at a central collection point, its location and data collectors still unknown, where they can be read and interpreted. Results emerge as mysterious clipped fragments reminiscent of the poem-like quatrains of history's most famous seer, Nostradamus. In the 1990s, WebBot completed countless word searches and compiled trend reports. And in 2001, an unexpected pattern seemed to emerge.
I first heard about it in June of 2001 when one of my friends sent me an email saying that there's going to be something happening in late summer, high-rise buildings are going to be destroyed, airplanes, terrorism, many die. And I went, yeah, right, whatever, you know, and I ignored it. And 911 happened. A few years later, I got another message from my friend saying something again. I said, what's he saying now? And he's saying, southern city, flood, many die. And I said, okay, if anything happened, I would now start paying attention to this guy. Well, Katrina happened 3 weeks later in New Orleans.
Hurricane Katrina barreled into the southern coast of the United States on August 29, 2005, causing catastrophic floods and levee failures throughout 80% of the city of New Orleans. Nearly 2,000 people lost their lives. Property damage surpassed $100 billion. Those using WebBot as a predictive device began forecasting more trends, many of which supposedly point to a dark and dangerous future. The 2008 stock market crash, bank failures, mass unemployment, collapse of the housing market. According to some, WebBot saw it all coming.
Thank you so much for coming on. I know we've been exchanging messages for a while, and you're a busy guy, so it's a real pleasure to have you on. And this is my
Thank you much.
First time I'm doing a video conference for YouTube, so I'm looking forward to having you as the first guest. If to start off, if you could just kind of give me your background and just everything about predictive linguistics and how it works, and just to give the viewers a bit of a background in this part of the world.
Sure. I've done a lot of work for computer companies as a programmer, a software engineer, and also a specialist in debugging large network systems. And I used to set up back before the internet and this sort of thing. I created independent networks that would operate. So I had all of that kind of background. I did virtual private networks for telecasting before such things as YouTube and Skype and Zoom here, and had that background through the 80s and 90s. And then I stumbled on this idea as a result of a problem that one of my clients had with a very large database that was an operational failure. Okay, so it was extremely large, and it had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tables in a SQL database, and then it would create, on average, 400 temporary tables with each query. And so you would execute a query, and it would take up to 3 weeks to get back to you based on the amount of work that was going on the server at the time. And in examining what they were doing, I came across a very key feature relating to language. And it sparked my thinking on language to go towards the predictive linguistics. The two are not related, other than I had this aha moment when I was solving their problem. And the language, the way we stored the language then became extremely efficient in that database. We were able to remove hundreds of these tables collapse it down to 7 tables actually, and 1 temporary table for every query. And it would still might take days to print out all of the information it found, but it would start printing them out within 3 to 4 minutes and no longer than a half an hour, depending on how complex the query was, as opposed to weeks and weeks and weeks. So it was successful, and it had me thinking about these things. And I was on an airplane leaving Mexico City after an earthquake, and I had another aha moment about how the people in the airplane around me were discussing their psychic impressions, I guess you would say, of that pending earthquake before it happened. So I had come into Mexico City before this earthquake occurred. The earthquake was at an 8.1. Many people suffered and died. It was a terrible event. I was there for a couple of, I'm sorry?
What year was this?
93.
93.
And I suffered the usual kind of earthquake precursors that people reported without being aware of that they were indeed earthquake precursors. A slight headache, a tendency towards sleepiness, a bit of irregularity in hearing, and some other sensory things that if you were aware of them, apparently they would let you know that you were in an active seismic zone that was about to do something. In any event, hearing the airplane, the discussion in the airplane, all these people saying, "Oh yes, I should have known I'd had this dream," or all for 2 days prior to the earthquake, all I could think about was, and then they would give some example. And so I noticed that really what it was their language was that the linguistic center of the brain was what had picked up on or was going to be the expressive part of their psychic impression of this earthquake appearing. And so it made me think about language in general. And if we had a whole airplane full of people that had felt this, and I indeed had felt many of the things that they were describing without ever recognizing at that time that they were earthquake precursors. And I've been through a number of earthquakes in my life. I live in an earthquake seismic zone. I've been in Alaska, around the Ring of Fire, all of this kind of thing. And so it made this connection. And what I thereafter decided was that my idea was to aggregate everyone's emotional impressions by way of the choices of language, because we choose language to express emotion. All language basically embeds emotion. And if we hunt for particular kinds of words, if we find ourselves stumbling over words in a normal, casual conversation, right, about growing some plant in your garden, cultivating an eggplant. And if you're going to discuss this on a gardening forum, the range of emotion you can usually attach to the cultivation of an eggplant is relatively limited. And the words, therefore, are also relatively limited. If, for instance, we find ourselves searching for, reaching for, trying to discover new words to throw into that conversation about the eggplant, there is something that is prompting us to do that. It could be that we were attempting to impress the other person, we're trying to be clever, we're trying to improve our writing skills, and so on. However, in the vast majority of people, that would not be true. And thus, my reasoning was, if I found that we were outside of our usual words that were used to discuss the cultivation of eggplant in our garden, then indeed, there was some kind of a psychic impression that was trying to put itself out. I set myself the goal of trying to aggregate all of these the changes in all these conversations, and then to determine, if I was able to, what language within there was prescient, what was predictive, and therefore attempt to determine what it was predicting. Right. And it has worked over the years. It's been a 20-plus year effort. It's been successful in a number of ways, and I think the premise is valid, and that I've been proving it for a while. But of course, the mechanistic aspect of it all, getting it all done, can be quite the task. And I didn't realize how much of a task, or I probably never would have undertaken it.
Right. Do you have other people helping you out in aggregating the data and then sifting through it?
No, I wrote all of the software myself. It took me a number of years. I'm not much of a team fellow. I usually do my best work alone. and I don't like supervising people. So no, I've occasionally hired independent programmers to work on one part or another of things as I've gone forward, asking them to do these particular tasks while I was off doing some other aspect of it. But no, I've never had a team per se. I've got a guy that runs my servers for me. He does all of the scripting to maintain the servers, but doesn't intrude on the code that I run for the predictive linguistics. And that was written over the course of the 90s and the early 2000s before we had any comprehensive programming languages that would have allowed the task to occur. It was written before there were large libraries of code that I could have tapped into. So I basically had to invent everything and write the code for everything. I had to write my own bots to do web scraping. I had to write my own natural language processor. I wrote this thing that I call the emotive reduction engine that assigns emotional values to words, which is a form of word vectoring, if the term is familiar. And so I just had to create all of this stuff on my own. If I'd only waited until this time right now, I could easily do this in about 2 months in Python. Because of all the huge amounts of libraries and tools that are available, the natural language processing tools, the web scraping tools, the data mining. You just fit all the pieces together and you've got 90% of what I have done. And then it would be a matter of simply recreating my lexicon and assigning the word vectors, and it's a done deal.
Right. And I guess you've been working on this software for almost about 20 years now. So it's had iterations over the years, and
yes,
it's
the first successful it took me about. I had the idea in '93. I thought about it over the course of '93 and '94, and sketched out all of the code I was going to need. Started programming in earnest in 1995. Bear in mind, I'm trying to run a business. I was selling a product that allowed people to read very fast from computers. I was trying to get that to take off. I was doing international consulting at the same time. So I had very little time to put into it, and it took me a number of years to get the code done. And then I had a very first one of the runs, I called them, where I would send the bots out to bring back the data, was done in '97. And it took me all of the latter half of '97 and the first part of '98, first few months of '98, to go through all of the language that was brought back and derive some conclusions from it.
Excellent. Clif, I wanted to get your insights a little bit on part of the reasons why I really enjoy reading your reports and generally having any discussion with you is because of your understanding of the monetary system and hyperinflation. I've spent a lot of time going back in history and essentially reading the period from 1914 all the way to 1945 when we had the last major monetary transition. And obviously I'm not counting 1971 where we delinked.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I'm counting the period when the empires, essentially retooled and you went from, one empire to the other. Since 2008, I spent a lot of time trying to predict, by looking at history, where things would end up in 2016, 17. But the conclusion I did come to that the cycle would not last more than 8 to 9 years before the transition started. And for a long period, I think I'd gotten so shocked and awed with the 2008 event that I kept on waiting for an event. And eventually with time, I realized that it's a process, not an event. Because when we go back and read history, we, read 30 years condensed essentially into, maybe 3 hours, 4 hours, or however many hours it takes to read through books. But, the process itself, when you're going through it, change seems relatively slow and things happen gradually. So, for me, it was phenomenal once, I stumbled upon one of your reports just browsing through the web. And it really, at that point, the cryptocurrency element was introduced because of your one of your reports. And so I wanted to kind of understand, I wanted to first, before, we discuss anything on cryptocurrencies, I wanted to first understand hyperinflation. What your views are on hyperinflation, what we're experiencing at the moment, because it's happening differently in different parts of the world. The US is at a different stage. The Eurozone is at a different stage. I think emerging markets are at a totally different stage. It just comes down to the level of consumer debt that's out there in each market and the associated sovereign debt. So I wanted to get your take on that. And if you could kind of, illuminate all of us with, hyperinflation.
Yeah, I see it slightly differently. Okay, so yes, consumer debt and sovereign debt are key indicators, but they usually show up in my reading and my understanding. Those things are showing up as a trailing indicator. So the inflation, hyperinflation period, I really like to look at. Is one that very few people ever really do. And the reason I like to look at it is because in that example, we have a homogeneous population, a homogeneous culture,
Mhm.
and external influences on that culture and their own internal within the culture was undergoing a political shift, a schism, a breakdown, and then a reformation. So we had all these stressors at the same time, and it is in a language, albeit a difficult one to deal with, but it is very precise about attempting to communicate their emotional response, especially to reality-based kind of things. Excuse me, even at the abstraction of money. And this is the German inflation, but not in 1923, but rather the German hyperinflation that occurred over the course from 1917 and expressed itself the end of 1919. And so we had a very interesting kind of a situation form there where we had hyperinflation without the money being spent. So it was a period of time where, as a result of World War I and the damage that had been inflicted upon the Kaiser's empire, which was in the process of shifting over into a republic, which was from a homogeneous population that had nonetheless been spread among many warring states that had still yet to fuse into a national identity. So Germany as a concept was very young at that point, in spite of having been established as by the Prussians in the mid 1800s. It had yet to gel, if you want to think of it that way, into a national identity. But nonetheless, they were stuck with a national currency that was becoming hyperinflated due to the war reparations that were required, as well as their own monetary system and the lack of tradable gold and silver. So everything was there for a pristine study of the emotions of hyperinflation. And we find ourselves in similar echoes of parts of that period of time now. The echoes that we're seeing now in some countries are stretched out a great deal. And I agree with you, by the way, it's all a process, and that process is just agonizingly slow. It would be ever so much better, in my opinion. I'm one of those guys who wants to take his pain now and get it over with. So this creep business drives me crazy. But in that period of time, in the 1917 period of time, hyperinflation ramps up. And what the people did was to hide away the money. It was not until the very last part of the hyperinflationary period that they realized that the purchasing power had totally degraded, and then they spent the money as rapidly as they can, which led to that response early in the Weimar Republic, because it had already been inculcated in the population. They had already learned that paper money was no good, and even the government's gold could be no good. And so they spent it very early in 1923 with the Weimar in hyperinflation. They just started spending as soon as it started getting into their hands. Unlike this other period of time, which is the 1917 to 1919 hyperinflation, which was actually arguably as devastating on the purchasing power and the population as the 1923 period, but without the staggering numbers that we see showing up in the Weimar Republic. Mm-hmm. Okay, so hyperinflation is, when we think about it, can be looked at as a mechanistic viewpoint, more money chasing fewer goods, but it's also an assault on individual emotions. It's an assault on our emotions at a key level, because one could argue that outside of interpersonal relations with your own family, and even perhaps for even more than that, an individual's relationship with money is at the core of their life from the time they learn the concept of money until they die. There's no other relationship level that we carry with us at a conscious level on a daily basis throughout our existence. And arguably, because we deal with money very frequently throughout our day, making small purchases, trying to get more of it, all of these kind of things, our relationship with money at an individual level, at an emotional level, is far stronger than many of our other personal relationships on this planet. Thus, the emotional component of it is actually, in my opinion, the driving force. So Gresham's law that you spend out the bad money and save the good money, I think is an expression of the emotional value and relationship that you put on the individual manifestations of your relationship with money. So you have a relationship with money, and someone offers you one form of money and someone else offers you another form of money. They're both money. You have to attach emotions to those independent of each other, but at the same time in the aggregate as a generic form of money. And you'll find that you have an emotional response to some money more than others. So people that live in border areas that have the potential to deal daily with currency from 2 or 3 countries will find that they actually have an emotional response to one country's currency that is entirely different from another country's currency. They'll tend to spend one more rapidly, and frequently that will align with the fundamentals. Maybe that country that they spend the currency of is in chaos. Maybe their government isn't all that solid. Maybe there are other reasons to think of it as a less worthy credit risk. But basically, we're aware, especially these days with the internet and so on, of the debt-based aspect of the relationship with money. So in the past, you would have gold, and gold was an intrinsic amount of money it had no necessarily intrinsic worth or value other than your relationship to it as money, but you could count, and I use that word advisedly, you could rely upon everyone else also to a greater or lesser extent, but to some extent, having that emotional relationship with gold such that they would take it in exchange for, in an exchange. Whereas that's not necessarily true of fiat money, of paper currencies. And we have a different relationship with those paper currencies as we discover over time that some are actually worth more than others. And it's very disturbing to us at an emotional level to become aware, and I think we're aware at a less than conscious level, long before it enters our consciousness, that the money is being degraded, that its purchasing power is disappearing in the form of inflation. And I think to a certain extent, whether or not we've ever experienced it, hyperinflation is a real worry to all of us. At an anxiety level, it's an anxiety about the future. Will the money maintain its value? Do I have to spend it right away? Can I save in it? All of these various questions are dealt with at an emotional level as fast as they are dealt with at an intellectual level. And thus my approach of looking at the financial system and its transitions as large societal emotional shifts seems to have some real value, especially in the level of predictive linguistics, because it is relatively easy, as these things go, to associate emotional values with words, especially as those words are representative of either fear, anxiety about the future, or depression and upset about actions in the past that can't be corrected, opportunities missed, this sort of thing. And because we can bifurcate emotions fairly easily about that kind of a level and attach them to certain words, it's been able to work especially well within the financial realm. Now, where it breaks down is exactly where I've run into that breakdown or that obstacle in the 615. In dealing with gold and silver, okay, because it's able to be manipulated. And so some individuals, understanding that emotions can be shifted, especially in large groups, by key levels of words being applied by key individuals, etc., will attempt to game the system, so to speak, and manipulate the markets for their own personal or their political agendas, but for some perceived benefit. And as long as the market is very small, it's extremely easy to do so. As we get up, we find that this same sort of currency, as we go into larger and larger groups, the same sort of currency manipulation kind of an idea comes along even into warfare. It's very difficult to get people to involve themselves in war, and the governments have to work very, very hard to get that to occur. Much, much harder than it is with money. The money level has a lot more emotion, and it's more concentrated into a smaller subset of words, and so it's easier to manipulate. And we find ourselves within this gold and silver market. They've been able to manipulate that market basically since the British began their silver adventure in the Opium Wars with China in the 1800s. And as a result of this manipulation being successful from that point forward, there is a library, if you will, a reserved level of skills in doing such manipulations. And we find that the gold and silver precious metals markets are incredibly manipulated at this moment, as to be truthful, to all other markets. Now, cryptocurrencies is also a small market, and it's also undergoing its first two assaults on its internal integrity at an emotional level, trying to push us into manipulation. And so far, it's been a very interesting experience as we've gotten into this.
In terms of, I'm familiar with the futures links as far as gold and silver, as in most other markets. For cryptocurrency, how easy is it to manipulate this market? It's a small market, but will they actually succeed in being able to tame this market? And which at the present moment they are succeeding. But eventually, given that on blockchain info you can track the actual addresses, the actual amount of quantity of the coins, is it going to be that easy to sustain this? Because I would think they'd have to go back and buy physical not physical, but actual cryptocurrency, and then go ahead and dump it, and at the same time put shorts in play simultaneously. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, is this something they can actually tame?
You hit the key element there with the word sustain. Okay, in your question. So yes, they can do it, and I don't believe they can sustain it, and precisely for the reasons you bring up, that this is not a market that can be easily shorted, in that you can only in a limited sense create the unlimited quantities of virtual currencies in futures markets, the way they can create unlimited quantities of physical commodities such as silver and gold by selling out paper shorts. So, and the only reason they're able to do that is because they actually control the delivery of the precious metals themselves. And so therefore, they're the ones in charge of it all. In cryptocurrency, we have the transparency that you bring up on the blockchain.info. So you can see who's doing what. And it goes right to the heart of sustainability. Right at the moment, they're still trying the same old tricks that they've done in the past, and they're having some level of response that they may deem to be successful, but it's not necessarily, well, we know it's not sustainable, but it's also not necessarily what they're attempting to achieve directly. So in the case of the silver market, they might dump on virtual silver in order to suppress the price and just keep it down as they slowly harvest little tiny bits of money off of everybody that's foolish enough to invest against the manipulators. In the cryptocurrency markets, we've had a recent episode here where they're using the Mt. Gox, I guess you'd have to say rake off or debris of the Mt. Gox fiasco as the mechanism by which they're manipulating Bitcoin and thus all of the other markets, bearing in mind that Bitcoin is the gateway for most people into the other cryptocurrencies. There's other relatively few places you can just turn fiat directly into one of the altcoins, for instance. And you usually have to go through Bitcoin and then buy Ethereum, et cetera, et cetera. And so there were a number of Bitcoin that were held by the trustees in Japan in the Mt. Gox fiasco, and they've recently sold those in 3 tranches. And they did it in okay, so to speculate as to the why they did it is going to their intent. We don't really know what their intent is as to why Mt. Gox trustee would participate, what the situations were there. It does appear, though, that one could say conclusively that it was the Mt. Gox sale that terminated the natural process by which Bitcoin market was expressing itself from the end of December and still continues to this day. So it jumped it off of the track that chartists would otherwise have been able to rely upon. And it was done in a very heavy-handed manner. My characterization there. I can't say if they did it deliberately using a heavy hand, or if it was just ignorance that they were just sort of pounding around trying to do their sale, or if there was no consideration whatsoever on their part about the impact of their sale on the market itself. But we do know that the effect has been that every one of the 3 large sales that came out of the Mt. Gox trustee were at key points in our inflection as to where we're at right now. So this brings up a couple of thoughts relative to the emotional impact of that particular action on the Bitcoin marketplace. One could speculate that there was some attempt by some large, powerful group to recreate the bear market that existed after the Mt. Gox crash in 2013. There we had an almost 2-year period of time that we were in this, what people would call sideways trading or a bear market. There was no real emotional gain and so on. It was very much sort of a waiting game as people, as the whole Bitcoin infrastructure tried to recreate itself, because a lot of it went down with Mt. Gox. Mt. Gox being at that point the premier exchange and connection to fiat. Right. And it was all bogus. I mean, Mt. Gox was just the most poorly coded, wild understanding of markets that anybody could imagine. And so it should have died, and it was nice that it died early in the process. But we're still dealing with this process that began in 2013, and someone is using their influence with the trustee and with those sales to attempt to, in my opinion, alter the future of the Bitcoin market for whatever gain that they expect to get from it, and for however long that they expect it to occur. Now, the way in which it's sold, some people have missed. So there was the big sale that capped the $20,000 run-up, which should have actually gone to about $23,000 in my forecast. It should have gone to 23,000, and then we should have had a crash back that would have resulted in 13,880 by the 3rd week in February, which coincidentally actually did occur. If you sum up all of the Bitcoin, Bitcoin Gold, and Bitcoin Cash, we were about 13,700.
You said that in previous reports that what you're picking up, you're not sure if that's all the various iterations of Bitcoin.
Right. And initially that number, when it came out, the 13,880, was before any of the forks. And so it was looking at the Bitcoin language in general, plus as each fork has come across, I have to do more work, because I have to go through and differentiate, or I have to capture and put into my lexicon the differentiation in language about each of the Bitcoins relative to that fork. There's subtle differences in the language, and it takes time for that language to mature. So there's been yet hardly any language that's differentiated for Bitcoin Gold. There's been a significant amount of language that's differentiated for Bitcoin Cash, so I can now track those two separately. To a smaller degree, Bitcoin Cash will be less reliable because there's just not as large of a lump of words to track. But anyway, so the manipulators, or the manipulation of the market, was successful. It capped the run-up, which stopped the emotional upwelling that was heading into cryptocurrencies and snowballing and becoming very much a potential problem for regulators, for anybody involved in supporting the fiat currency systems, because as more and more people get into cryptocurrencies, they have a tendency to take their store of wealth out of fiat, shift it over into cryptocurrencies, and then stay in the cryptocurrency business, keeping their wealth in there and only occasionally dipping out in order to deal with their real world needs of, paying rent, paying taxes, these kind of things. And that's not good for the powers that be, for the fiat currency producers. They want you at 100% engaged. They want all of your emotion in there, because otherwise they find themselves on the bad side of Gresham's law. If we all conceive of the cryptocurrencies as gaining in value over time and being more solid, more trustworthy than fiat currencies, then we'll consider fiat currencies to be the bad currency, and we'll spend that first and get it out of our hands first. And they're actually, the fiat currency people are counting on a certain amount of destruction of currency within possession, which is to say they target 2% inflation here in the United States, and they're stealing 2% of your money from you every year, and they tell you that in advance. What they don't tell you is they're actually counting on about 6% of that money being lost. stolen, hidden, literally dropping out of circulation so that they don't have to deal with it as an element of the flow of currency through the system, which is an indication to all of us at a visceral emotional level of hyperinflation. So it's very much like a situation if you go to a store and you see that the market is very crowded with people anxiously trying to spend, looking around for things to buy, then you will experience a response to your neighbor's anxiety, and you will become anxious as well, and you will start emulating their behavior, even without understanding why you might be doing it. And then, of course, the next thought is to ask somebody next to you, what the hell is going on and why are we doing this? And get some form of intellectual understanding that backs up your emotional response. But the emotional response is there as soon as you encounter that behavior within the market and you start emulating it. So under the circumstances, that was their goal, was to stop that behavior, which was showing signs of escalating within the general market for fiat currencies as more and more people became acquainted with, comfortable with, and supportive of cryptocurrencies. And so we ran into this situation where they capped the $20,000 run in Bitcoin with a very large sale. Then there were a couple of weeks pass, and just as Bitcoin had done its usual recovery from a 40% dip, which in the past few years has been a good sign to get on in and buy, and just as that had occurred, they once again capped that rise and drove it down another 40%. Very atypical, never happened in Bitcoin history prior to that. And then they did it one further time here a little bit ago as we went and had this third rise. They hit us again with another 30% retrace. Again, something that's never occurred. But on each of on the first one, they had gained a certain amount of time. The second one, the time period was less before there was the recovery. And the third one, there was again, time period was less for the recovery. So in my way of thinking, we can look at this in hyperinflationary terms in two aspects of it. One is that hyperinflation is continuing. The hyperinflation of fiat currency is continuing at a huge scale. It is different in the USA, different in Europe, different in Asia, et cetera. But we're seeing it all throughout all the central banks on all those countries that do have central banks. They're in a race with their own debt buildup, where the unfortunate thing about debt that people need to understand is that there's the sovereign debt, but there's also private debt. And as private debt grows, it has a tendency to need to be serviced. The banks want you to pay your credit card bill. They want you to pay your debt on a monthly basis, incremental kind of a thing. Governments, they're not so concerned. The government sovereign debt is frequently taken on with the expectation it won't be paid in the lifetime of the politicians that agreed to take it on. And the banks are also of this understanding. They're using it in a different way entirely than as a source of deferred income. Not true with private debt. And private debt has escalated so much throughout the world because the banks follow a model where the banks must grow the debt or they die. Right. They actually will crumble and die. And so that being the case, they were very concerned about the move into cryptocurrencies because it has actually coincidentally been in direct proportion to the amount of bank death as the cryptocurrencies are going up. The banks are clearly dying. Their influence is dying. Their products are not being taken. The debt is not being taken out. And people are, in fact, able to make up enough fiat through the cryptocurrency transition to pay off debt. Not a good thing for banks at all. And so I think, so I'm speculating that someone who supports banking was behind the recent push down on the cryptocurrencies and the manipulation against the wave of the hyperinflation. And that's the second aspect that we have to keep in mind, that this is against a wave of hyperinflation that has not stopped. It continues. And so the question is then brought up in our minds, if they cannot sustain their ability to continue to sell in these large tranches Bitcoin, then once that period is over, what is the end result? In my way of thinking, it's bottled up emotions that then have to surface out again from the hyperinflation, and so we'll see a bull run in cryptocurrencies that is atypical.
the stuff that they've delayed, essentially that energy will release much more violently on the upward.
Exactly, much more violently. It'll have to come out in a much shorter period of time in a much less graceful way.
Mm-hmm. Now, Clif, I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, I like to trace ownership of various structures, and as I look at all the exchanges, Coinbase, Gemini, Kraken being the primary exchanges in the U.S., based out of the U.S. And when you look at the ownership structure in the back end, I mean, Coinbase is owned by the Digital Currency Group. It's got New York Life involved in it. The Digital Currency Group has an investment from MasterCard as well. What are your thoughts on? I mean, I definitely feel like the system, at least in the Western part of the world, is supporting cryptocurrencies, and they are fairly supportive, both on regulation and in adoption. In direct ACHs from banks, it's fairly easy in the US to link your bank account to any of the regulated exchanges. But I mean, one of the things that I thought about in this downturn that I was essentially trying to research was, it seems that a lot of money has flowed out of the banking system. That can essentially create a liquidity crunch. So this may be an attempt on the general systems part to essentially slow down the transition, not necessarily stop it, but make it gradual so that the system doesn't implode on itself. Just wanted to get your thoughts on it, and if there's anything in the data regarding how long this downturn could be. As you mentioned, in 2013, it was for an extended period of time. Obviously, things are a lot different given all the different gateways. I think Circle just came online yesterday or day before. Mm-hmm. So we've got, a lot of gateways, and Go and some of the other Veritasium, all these other gateways are coming online as well. So just wanted to kind of get your overall thought on where things are headed, and what if you feel that there is support from this as well.
I see the aspects of this that you're discussing relative to the cryptocurrencies' hidden level of support by people that have some power in the current system. So the current system is not unaware of cryptocurrencies, and a large number of individuals, by large, we're talking thousands, tens of thousands, are indeed involved in the support of cryptocurrencies, and they understand the nature of where we are at in terms of a transition. So in our previous discussion, we'd had some talk about the death of empires and how empires die predictably, usually around their money and so on. We have the American century labeled by Americans, but it needs to be acknowledged that there has indeed been a dollar empire that's been forced on the planet through the various different mechanisms we need not go into now. And that dollar empire has been in existence since 1945, has wreaked incredible havoc across the planet, but it is, in my opinion, it's in the process of dying. And astute individuals within that system are aware of this. And they are attempting to, they are doing their best to transition themselves and their those things they care about, their organizations, into the new system. Now, a number of years ago, my predictive linguistics, it became quite clear in over the course of like 2015. At first, I didn't believe it because of the nature of the change in language. I had to let it sit for a couple of months and see that it was repeated. But over the course of 2015, it became clear that the powers that be on this planet had chosen to take humanity into what I called sci-fi world, science fiction world, and that we would be heading to a world that would have greater levels of connectivity, more instant level of communication, would come up to the point of flying cars, anti-gravitics, what we might think of as free or very low-cost energy, and all of the combinoric potentials for expansion that those sorts of base infrastructure will allow. So free energy makes totally transforms the planet. You can get clean water at much lower cost. Free energy basically takes the huge energy cost out of everything that we might wish to accomplish. And so its impact is going to be giant, although it will take, like everything else, it's a process. It'll take years and years. Nonetheless, the impact on the society is rather acute. because there's a schism that occurs when you go into this kind of world. And that schism is with your former identification and emotion with money, which was basically currency, something that many people in your generation are still 100% digital in their interaction with money. But people in my generation, we actually handled a lot of cash. And that constant eye-hand coordination with the money, looking at the numbers and so on, has a tendency to reinforce in your brain all of the emotions that we discussed about money earlier. And so you have a different set of emotions with generations than myself, many of whom have never ever dealt with currency in any great extent, but they still have an emotional response to their digital assets and so on, even though it's a digital asset representing fiat. And they have an issue. The banking system has an issue relative to liquidity, as you noticed, or as you noted, but is their other issue is emotional, and they're really aware of that. If we go into a sci-fi world where I have a flying car and could potentially go and have lunch on the moon or something, then in that world, it doesn't do to have fiat currency. The fiat becomes cumbersome. We must be 100% digital in our assets in terms of being able to pay for my lunch on the moon. And they're not necessarily going to take my specie, my paper money. And so under those circumstances, we need our money to be as digital as the rest of everything that we're dealing with. And we need it in a secure form that eliminates the potential for the double spend issue. So we have to acknowledge that centralized money in a digital format is very costly. And if you're a merchant, you understand what I'm talking about. You have to pay such a large percentage to these companies that handle the credit cards or debit cards that allow digital spending. And what they're doing with that money is fundamentally attempting to defeat fraud and double spending and so on. And so we might, as a social order, be paying as high as 10% when we think of salaries, fees, and all of this other for digital money in a fiat form. And it's all due to the centralized nature and the instability that centralized nature brings to the money, because humans naturally want to game things. If a system stays in place long enough, humans will try and game it just because we're highly efficient and we want to be lazy. And so, if we can steal effectively, we will do that as opposed to steal ineffectively from that large system. And so the cryptocurrencies offer something that the centralized systems can never produce, and that is a trustless, self-referencing, and self-reliable understanding of money, where the money protects itself by the very nature of the cryptocurrency. It eliminates trust. You don't have to trust any individual in the process because the system itself is trustworthy because of the consensus algorithm. And so digital money becomes very effective then, because you don't have to put the up to 10% of all of your assets into protecting the other 90%. It goes away. It just is not an issue anymore. And under the circumstances, then cryptocurrencies become a very highly efficient form of money with an extra overage in there that used to be lost to the wasteful activity of guarding against fraud, which is now inculcated into the software, where the software protects itself against the fraud and we don't have to do the work. And so cryptocurrencies are, by that definition, a very much more efficient form of money than we could ever come up with. And we see that efficiency expressed in the fact that we don't, as individuals, have to put any of our effort into protecting ourselves from fraud in dealing with the cryptocurrencies, as long as we're within the protocol of the cryptocurrencies itself. Whereas even with gold and silver, you would have to examine the gold to make sure it really was gold and wasn't fraudulent. And silver, it becomes even more difficult. There are certain tests you can do to gold that make it relatively straightforward, but with silver and other metals, it becomes very difficult. And so even with paper currencies, you'll see people checking the paper all the time to make sure it's not counterfeit. And, and as an aside, that's really funny because every year they're counterfeiting it.
I actually, it's funny. Something you mentioned earlier is counting money. And I moved back to Pakistan about a year and a half ago. And I'm not used to counting physical cash because most merchants here, because of the fees that you mentioned, don't prefer to take credit cards. So I'm always messing up and, usually either giving extra money away because I'm not sure, I'm not counting it, I'm not paying attention to it. And then the other problem is that I don't actually look at the cash when I get it. I just put it in my wallet. And then it just so happened recently that I realized, got a rude awakening, where I gave some currency to a store and the guy said this is a fake note. And that's when I realized, I'm like, wow, counterfeit money does exist. It was my first encounter with counterfeit money. So yeah, I mean, it's traditional paper money has all sorts of drawbacks. Cliff, one other element that I wanted to pick your brains on was, as we're constructing a digital format, I mean, we're already in a digital financial world, but the world is right now in a hybrid state where you have paper assets and you have digital assets. Mm-hmm. And then the entire structure above it, when between stocks, credit, everything above it. But our money, our world has always been base money, and true wealth managers understand the concept of gold and silver and having a hedge in their portfolio. So there is still some emotional attachment to gold and silver, and I think many of the people in younger generation people don't have any attachment to gold and silver, especially millennials. I think even my generation doesn't really have that, attachment. In this part of the world, I definitely see that, people that are in their 70s, because of their parents who'd experienced tougher times in the previous transition from 1914 to 1945, they do understand the value of precious metals and keeping some portion of their wealth in precious metals as a preserving capability. But do you believe that there's an attempt to create Bitcoin, Litecoin, to attach that emotional value to create stability in the new digital system as base money, and essentially build the entire structure on top, where you've got all sorts of lending platforms, essentially copy the entire financial system in the cryptocurrency realm? I mean, is that a plausible?
They're trying to do that. There are those people that are you're correct, that are in the financial system now. They're attempting to take their model over and to adapt it into cryptocurrencies. I would agree with that statement. Much of the else of that would be speculation on intent, and I wouldn't necessarily be able to go there in a meaningful way. But we certainly do see those people that are within credit cards scrambling around trying to figure out how they're going to run credit cards if it's based against a self-policing cryptocurrency as opposed to the system now, because they make a lot of their profit, so to speak, is tied up in the fees and so forth that they charge, and those fees are arguably excessive for the amount of work they do to prevent the fraud. So, but they are attempting to replicate it. I'm not confident that they will be successful at that level. Now, here's the thing. We have to understand that this is indeed a process, and we may find that gold and silver are still being traded on the planet for goods 100 years from now, even though the vast majority of the planet has moved on to cryptocurrencies. The same would be true of any given fiat currency, as long as the sovereign state that issues that fiat currency is still doing so. And I can cite a historical example that was clean, so to speak, and that is that when the Europeans first came to North America in this latest wave. We're not talking the Vikings, we're talking the settlers that came from England, France, Spain, Portugal, etc. And they started settling in the US. They brought their money with them. When they came here, it was not as though this continent was unoccupied. It was not as though this continent did not have a continental-wide financial system, which it did. And in fact, much of the history of the United States starts with these Dutch people coming over to what is now the area of New York and buying a great tranche of land. And they were laughingly saying that they purchased it for some beads and shells. Well, they were denigrating the beads and shells because they had no attachment to them whatsoever. But to the Native Americans, some 60 to 70 million strong at that stage, across the continent, this was a national, continental, intertribal money system called wampum, which was based on a very finite resource, which were these strange shells that they harvested off Vancouver Island, slightly to the north of me. It was the only place you could find these, and very much in the way that the people in India would wear the gold at ceremonial points like weddings and so on. They would actually wear the dowries and these kind of things. The Native Americans would take these monovalve sea creatures and string them. And so the breastplates that you would see on the Native Americans in movies and so forth in our modern time are not ceremonial. They're not armor. They're a display of wealth, because each of those shells, even broken, was a valuable store of wealth in the wampum system. That system persisted for over 120 years after the conquest of this country, of this continent, started by the European invaders or colonists, depending on your viewpoint, right? But 120 years later, there were still people trading in wampum. And so it went through a number of complete generations in its sustainability. So the process is going to be muddy, to say the least, as we go forward on this. And basically, I'm characterizing it as more and more people are exiting the fiat system and moving into cryptocurrencies. But even as they do so, each individual there for a number of years in their life will still intermittently have to deal with the old system. Just as there were people in the continental US here that dealt both in the wampum system and in the gold and silver system of the invading Europeans.
I mean, you answered my question spot on. That's essentially the emotional value of any form of currency doesn't break immediately. It's a transition, and the whole thing is a process.
And a very ugly one.
Right. Cliff, I wanted to talk specifically about a few cryptocurrencies. And you don't have to get into any price predictions, because I do understand that right now there's a period that we're going through that is somewhat unpredictable. But what you see in your data, I mean, I was very curious about Litecoin particularly. You kept on describing that it goes to 1/5 of Bitcoin. What are some of the what are you seeing in your data sets that leads to Litecoin going to 1/5?
The language in Litecoin is extremely similar to Bitcoin, as is the underlying structure. Litecoin is simply a clone of Bitcoin anyway. It's not wholly created cryptocurrency out of new cloth. The language within Litecoin speaks to it as being a very effective currency, whereas Bitcoin has increasingly differentiated itself as a store of value. Once that language started appearing, I would have to guess maybe it grew to real seriousness this time last year. It was the 1/5 aspect of it is spoken of within the data sets. So I can see that there is an emotional attachment to the spending of Litecoin at a rate of, how do I want to phrase this so it's meaningful? The emotional tone, the sum values for the words around Litecoin are equivalent in the currency level with Bitcoin. In terms of their emotional sum, the value of that, of all of the numbers or all the word vectors relating to Litecoin and Bitcoin for currency are the same. Where there's a differentiation is that Bitcoin has 4 times as many words relative to Bitcoin as a store of value. Oh, okay. All things being equal, then it's going to reach a 1/5 level of emotional response by the humans, and its concentration will be in currency, which will have a tendency to reinforce that because you'll be spending the Litecoin, accumulating more to spend, et cetera.
Which makes sense. I mean, it's the quantity of Litecoin is essentially 4 times as many as Bitcoin. And in essence, I mean, it seems like there's a scarcity component that kicks in both cryptocurrencies at some point in time in the future, which could also cause these, essentially the price of Litecoin to appreciate to that level. People are making
right, and the scarcity aspect of it is key, even though it's in the far distant future. The scarcity aspect of it is one of those elements that form the trust a component of our emotional response to it. I trust Bitcoin because there's only going to be approximately 21 million of them, and I can trust the algorithm to see to that. I don't have to trust any human, so it's like, oh, I can't be cheated relative to that.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. You said you mentioned temporal markers for Litecoin that you're waiting in order to assess when the 1/5 ratio could hit. I was just curious about that. What specifically are temporal markers, and what?
Okay, temporal marker. So you have to what I do is I take all the data, and when it comes back, because each of the words has a word vector around it that relates to what I called its propagation. So let me back up. I did my first run in 97. And then I discovered how much I did not know. Okay, I had all of these words, but I had no idea how far the words would carry forward in time. And so I had to set out, and I did for a number of years, I did what I called propagation studies, where I would see if I could seed particular language, could it catch on at an emotional level, and how long would it go into the future, and how wide would it spread, how much differentiation would it provide, and how much impact would it provide on other people's language. And I did these studies for a number of years, and so I derived certain values for language. It was in that process that I discovered that I could make forecasts that showed, because I deal in set theory, so I get all kinds of language around a particular clump of words, and they're all in the same set. And so my thinking was that if half of those words appeared within more or less the time that was forecast, then those that were forecast to appear later in time would also appear. I would have higher confidence in those because the other half of that set had already manifested. And so I started to think of that half that had already manifested by the time I started looking at the longer term ones as temporal markers. And then I was able to slice my differentiation of time finer around the language. This is a process itself over a number of years. And I sliced the differentiation of time around language finer and finer and finer to the point where I could make forecasts about language that would hit relatively soon, and not be a number of years out, but it might only be a number of months or a number of days. And if it appeared, then I would know, I would have a little bit higher confidence in the set as a total, and then I would go to the next one. These were temporal marker sets. And so I could take out subsets of the larger set and that were describing something along the road. Now, when I say along the road in time, what I would do with my data set is I would display it in such a way that down in the x-axis, like with a regular kind of a chart, would be a representation of time, my guess as to the time. And I would start with the time I grabbed the data, the time I did my processing as our base level all the way over on the left-hand side of the chart of the graph. And then the projection on the language would extend out all the way to the right-hand side. And whatever the length of time that was projection would be that entire value of the time. And then as we actually, then I would slice all the language and say, okay, 2 weeks out, this language should appear, 3 days out, this language should appear. And those were temporal markers on the way towards that end, so to speak, of that particular set. And so a temporal marker is simply in something that we can use to say that, yes, we're on this track. These events are playing out as forecast in the larger set. And it was at that stage that I started writing the reports about them, would describe the large set of language, and then attempt to describe the temporal markers that were sliced out to give us indications that indeed the overall forecast was sort of progressing along.
Sure.
Sort of makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, now temporal markers.
Sorry.
I say one thing about temporal markers is that there can be public, but also some of them I'm keeping private because some of them can be could be self-fulfilling prophecies. I don't want to have the language echo back to me just because I happen to mention it.
I got it. You don't want to actually influence the data in the future by giving those.
Correct.
That makes sense. That makes absolute sense. Okay. I'll jump into a couple of quick ones. The August 2019 for Litecoin. I know they're supposed to have. I mean, when cryptocurrencies have in terms of mining rewards, does that tend to have a significant impact on their price equivalent in fiat?
It has in the past. We've seen that the significance of the price, at least insofar as Bitcoin is concerned and its clone Litecoin, usually leads to something that we could say is, in a broad way, is a doubling of its value. And usually that doubling occurs in a relatively short period of time. In Bitcoin's recent past, it's been about a month to 45 days.
Before or after the halving, the reward halving?
After the halving, it takes about a month to 45 days, and then you've really ramped up the price on it, and off you go. It makes it much more attractive. It's an emotional boost that can't be discounted, and that emotional boost that they're trying to, and we see it now with cryptocurrencies. When someone does an ICO in an altcoin, you'll see them try and do things to increase the emotional response to their altcoin, including airdrops. Now, I would argue, and I could make a really good case for this, that airdrops are exactly counterintuitive. you should not do an airdrop of free currency to people because it depreciates the value of that currency in their minds and that emotional impact simply because it's free. The number of people you're going to attract because it's free money are also going to be getting that money, and it's going to be on the bad side of Gresham's law. So if I were running an ICO, the last thing I would do is an airdrop because it's not going to benefit the long-term health of the underlying currency or token.
But there is an argument that it creates an emotional attachment. I mean, I have friends myself that got, I believe it was Rayblocks, which has been renamed recently, and they ended up purchasing Rayblocks subsequently because of the airdrop. So
true. And here's the problem with that. The problem is that they're going to sell that as rapidly as they can.
Yes.
As soon as it gets to a point where they think that they've been, or where their emotions would be compensated for the level of emotional risk they took in dealing with it and adding their own fiat to it, as soon as it reaches that point, they will sell. This is just so predictable. And what you really want, if you're running a currency, is for people to hold.
Sure, absolutely. And so the term hodling is developed, and it seems that, there's certain cryptocurrencies where the people tend to hold them more. They're not trading them frequently, short term. And does that end up impacting the price significantly because of circulation? What is
at this point in our market? At this point in our market, correct. So it's all flow, it's all velocity. So if we look at fiat currency from a viewpoint of a sovereign, we find that most of their time, most of the federal bank's time, central bank's time is spent trying to moderate the velocity of currency through their system. And it's because they have such crude aspects to control it with that we get into deflation and hyperinflation, both of which are really symptomatic of velocity and the amount of it moving through their system. So let's suppose that you're running a sovereign central bank like the United States, and they've got a Federal Reserve that says their goal is 2% inflation. Well, the way they measure that 2% inflation is really based on the velocity of the currency that they're creating through the entire system of the financial structure into goods, from which, so when I say into goods, you purchase goods that have a longer lifespan or usefulness than that currency offers at that point. And so it's the velocity of the currency that is the issue relative to whether or not inflation is perceived. So if we had a very tightly regulated system that was very intimately connected to its feedback system, then we would have very rapid jerks in inflation. As they would inflate the currency, it would go through the system very quickly and we would all feel it. Right now, we're in that other kind of hyperinflation, where they're hyperinflating like mad, but because they're hyperinflating the currency at the same time that the velocity of that currency is dropping, we're not feeling it at an emotional level. Their problem as central bank coordinators is that they're looking at this measure right here, the little tip of the velocity, wherever it's going in our social order, as their indicator for how much of this stuff out here to create. And what they don't get is that we'll cross a threshold here some point, and it'll become instantly visible that we can see this massive hyperinflation. And so the process is logarithmic, not arithmetic. Okay, so we don't do it on a logical, linear kind of a fashion. We get to the certain point where our emotions cave all of a sudden, and so we've crossed an emotional threshold, and we react as humans in that moment to that emotional response. And so one day, all of a sudden, we wake up and we've decided internally that we're in a state of hyperinflation and we need to spend as rapidly as we can. Whereas 2 days before, we were treating the money just regularly as we normally would. Even though the central bank has just been ratcheting up the level at which they create it like mad, it's just been sloshed out into these areas where it wasn't being spent through the system. So they could neither regulate how fast they were spending, how fast they were creating. And we as the spenders of those currencies were not really aware because of our own emotional relationship to it, that in fact hyperinflation, that we were living in a period of hyperinflation. So is it hyperinflation if you're in the fishing business and all the money is going into automobiles? You don't see it as you're selling your fish. The price of fish doesn't change. As far as you're concerned, there is no hyperinflation. But because there's all this money attempting to chase automobiles, there's hyperinflation in automobiles. Now, at some point,
In the US, I mean, at the peak of this previous, of the current cycle, art, housing, equities markets, bond markets. I mean, is that
ours.
and cars, of course.
Correct.
Is that
Correct. And it's a way of burying money and getting it out of the velocity equation. And so it's entirely velocity through the system that is the issue. So we have an emotional response to the cryptocurrencies because the velocity is regulated and the quantity is regulated by the algorithms that we know we can trust, because we don't have to trust humans. And now with the Bitcoin and some of these other cryptocurrencies, we also have the other aspect of it. There might be 21 million Bitcoins created over time, but there probably have already been multiple millions that are lost, that won't ever be spent, that are just going to be sitting on the blockchain with no ownership. And so it's going to cause scarcity to enter into the picture at a much tighter range than Satoshi had originally calculated. I don't know how much he'd calculated on people just being goofy and losing the things. But nonetheless, it'll increase its value over time. All of this is emotional in terms of our response. So if, people have been really odd. In Yap, we use giant stones for money. In North America, they used seashells for money. We've used gold, we've used diamonds, all different kinds of things, simply because humans could put an emotional attachment to them that then allowed them to consider that this lump of rock, whether it was gold or a diamond, somehow stored the extra calories that they had made as a farmer growing that food and selling it into the local community. And that the idea was that you could trade that lump of metal in the future to recover those calories and sustain your life forward. And so it's all emotional. There's no intrinsic value into any of it. That being the case, the real value that the cryptocurrencies bring is the decentralized nature of it being outside of the control of any given party, and then the autonomous, semi-autonomous nature of the currency itself, meaning that there's no other control at a social level. And then the other aspect of it is the trustless nature of it, that it's all algorithmic. You can see the source code, you know how it's being processed. You can, if you're willing to do it, you could build your own computer and write the code to be a miner. It may not be profitable, but you could then at that stage assure yourself that everything you were being told about the software and all of this stuff was indeed true, because you could actually watch it work on your machine, run it in a debugger, and see that indeed it was all behaving as had been warranted. Something you can't do with a central bank. Those are opaque. They don't show you anything that they're doing. And you have no idea how many trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars they're creating and giving them to their friends and relatives and all the corruption, et cetera. And so the trustless nature of the blockchain is going to remove, and is already starting to affect it, the huge rake off, the graft, the bakshish that is being taken off of the entire system by corruption.
Sure. Cliff, at the end, what I'd like to get from you is that, what are you seeing in your data sets? As you're still, I assume you're still running them constantly for being recorded. We talked about this period, which essentially is a bit of a sideways period that we're encountering right now. Are you seeing anything in your sets that seems to indicate that this current manipulation or sideways consolidation period is going to have an uptick in the near future? I mean,
Yeah.
Are you?
I'm organizing the data at this point around language that indicates that uptick will begin in June. Okay, the will be palpable in through summer and continue on in through fall. The data sets show that we're going to go. I have a number of temporal markers for the latter part of March and into April that should validate some sets for May. Now, the uptick in June is independent. It's in another set that's independent of this, of the temporal markers for May, but the two sets are co-joined around an intersection. And so it's not like if one doesn't occur, the other won't occur. But if one does occur, then it gives me a lot more confidence in the June rise. Now, it may be that it becomes palpable in June because my data sets are dealing with emotion, they don't deal with it with numbers very well. Numbers rarely come through because while we have emotional associations with numbers, is not quite the same as emotional associations with what we would consider to be things like money or beings like people. And so we don't get numeric values the same. However, the level of language that's coming through for the uptick in June would tend to suggest that by the time we get to June, there will have been a noticeable change in patterns that within the cryptocurrencies that has then in its own way produced a notable change within the language we're using to talk about the cryptocurrencies. So we can look at it this way. If you were to go and get on cryptocurrency boards now, forums, and sample the text that's through there, you could assign an emotional value that might end up being slightly depressed. Okay, everybody's not, they're a little bummed out. They're not feeling very good now. They don't have that emotional response, the dopamine of the wealth effect going on. But by the time we get into June, the data is clearly indicating that that situation has turned around and that the elation is back. We have a lot more words about abundance, positive adventuring kind of words, unlimiting future kind of words, real growth kind of words showing. And for them to show up in the quantity that we're seeing in June speaks to your comment earlier about how those emotions long repressed will come out in a very violent way in a very short period of time, because that's how we define violence, is a lot of expression in a short period of time. And the data sets are clearly pointing towards that sort of an occurrence. I have a couple of temporal markers I'm waiting to see if they manifest that may indicate that the manipulation of the moment, the large tranche sales of Bitcoin, is over. And I should know, I think probably by the end of this month, in terms of what manifests in these little temporal markers, if that's going to be the case. They may still be trying that stuff as we go forward into the future. And I can't say at this stage because it's manipulation. It's conscious thought, someone attempting to harmonize with the market and control the emotions. Easy to do in a small market, but difficult to control when there's such a level of intensity of the emotion, because there's another aspect of this that we haven't discussed. And that is when we make a transition from one empire to another, from one currency form to another, when we change our allegiance, our emotional attachment from one currency to another, we are loath to go back. As humans, we don't ever want to admit we made a mistake that way. We want to basically reinforce our emotional response to this, that we made the appropriate choice, that the future is going to open up for us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once you've made that emotional shift over, it actually takes more energy for you to make that shift back than it took to get there in the first place, because we're not backwardly looking beings. And so now there's this emotional hurdle that is not reflected in the resistance and the floors and so forth within the price movement of Bitcoin. So the HODL language, hold on for dear life. And that language is representative to some extent of this extra energy required for us to abandon that position. So there's a whole lot of people like myself that to a certain extent, it's like, I'm going to hang on to Bitcoin and keep acquiring and keep involving myself in the crypto system, regardless of what the fiat guys do. And it comes down to, I have a rational thought that in the future, cryptocurrency have to be the course of the future because the old system is too lame and it's dying. But that is not really my reason for being a hodler. It is this emotional attachment I made to the cryptocurrencies once I left the old system, so to speak, that is my first barrier to not being a hodler, if that makes sense.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that there's a difference in the crypto world. There's a lot of people that have gotten in just for simply making money and going back into fiat. And I think there's the other mindset of individuals that actually understand that, the fiat system is gradually dying and you have to transition. And so they almost find it ridiculous to go back into that system, because what will you put the money in? Would you put it in land?
Exactly.
Some of the hard asset? So
yeah, precisely, yeah. I get questions like that all the time. Well, when should I sell my Litecoin? When should I sell my Bitcoin? And I respond to them and say, sell it for what? What are you going to sell it for? Do you want to get paper, you got to try and get some gold. You want to buy lead, you want to buy diamonds, so the question is, what are you going to convert it to? Swapping among other cryptocurrencies is an entirely different issue.
Absolutely. All right, Cliff, one last question for you. So in what you were saying, just so I understand it correctly, so now there was a timeline, in the predictive linguistics of the data you were getting back, in terms of what the growth was supposed to be till the end of 2018. I believe you stated this. I just wanted to confirm this. Again, while the timeline may have been pushed due to this manipulation that has kicked in the last 2 to 3 months, and it may continue for whatever period, or may not. Would we still meet some of those same initial tones that you were detecting earlier in your data sets? Would it just be compressed in a shorter period of time, or would it be?
That's my understanding. Correct. My understanding is that we're going to be dealing with much more compressed period of time, much more violent swings in pricing because of the suppressed emotions, rather than a situation of everything being pushed out further and then it playing out that same way. The emotions are the issue. Once there was an emotional track that was created and people started piling in on it, the manipulation has suppressed the emotion, but it hasn't pushed it out into the future for its manifestation. So it'll still attempt to manifest. It'll just come out in a bigger way.
And I really see it difficult this time around to go into that, extended period of dormancy or that sideways movement as we did in 2013, just because of the sheer number of entities that have moved in. We've got a futures market for cryptocurrency. There's talk of bringing Litecoin, Ethereum potentially into the futures market. And all the associated gateways and e-commerce. You've got Coinbase Commerce out there that's plug-in in multiple shops. So I don't see there seems to be a lot of fear based on the previous cycles that we may be in a period of dormancy for 2 years or whatever extended period of time. I personally don't see it. I mean, I see this as a period we have to go through, and I think when it comes out of this, we'll end up in a pretty, I think, startling place in terms of how much it rises. I think in one of your reports you said, the rise will cause anxiety. It was specifically for Bitcoin.
It'll be shocking. Absolutely shocking. You'll feel it in your stomach. Many people will have very poor digestion as a result of this, simply because everything will be happening so rapidly. It's hard to accept all the information. And I think you're quite correct. I think we are on a particular path that has been suppressed very temporarily, and that the expression of that path basically will not be denied. And it's really kind of funny, because here you have sovereign states that are creating cryptocurrencies, and they want their people to accept them. And as soon as they do that, it validates the whole idea of cryptocurrencies in those reluctant people that have yet to get into it, because here's their sovereign offering them a cryptocurrency as well. And so it makes them then have an attachment to cryptocurrencies in general. And so they're looking around, and then they start messing about with other cryptocurrencies. So it's sort of self-defeating on the part of the powers that be to both support the system at that level and then try and suppress it at the other level, which tends to lead people like yourself and Bix Weir into the idea that the recent suppression was an attempt to slow things down.
Right. Versus just to wrap it up altogether. I don't see the regulatory signs there. The CFTC, the SEC hearing was pretty much pro crypto. So, I see a lot of support from the system. What are your thoughts on the rise of interest rates? I mean, that's another thing that I'm concerned about, given we've had a change at the Fed. And, do you see interest rates in the US? I mean, at some point, the returns in crypto are going to be so astronomically phenomenal that traditional bonds or traditional assets are just going to start to seem ridiculous for, I would say, more and more of the general public. I mean, where do you see things going with interest rates this year, especially in 2000?
I don't know about the actual numeric values for those, but I do know that our data sets have forecast that the central banks, especially here in dollar land, are going to be faced with a situation where they push us over that emotional trigger, where they push us over an emotional barrier in their monitoring of the velocity of money, such that all of a sudden hyperinflation really is apparent. And then it will be an onrush into cryptocurrencies, because that's where the hyperinflation will be first boosting assets, and it'll actually boost the cryptocurrency asset faster than other items within our social order. And we're also in a weird situation globally where there's so many things, okay? So in the past, hyperinflation could hide in a brand new automobile, say 80 years later, or 80 years in the past, when we had a hyperinflationary period in the 1890s here in the United States. And in that period of time, it was the birth of the automobile industry. And automobiles represented an asset that, while we think of them as depreciating, in the early days when there were very few automobiles, they actually appreciated over time, even though their condition may have deteriorated, simply because not everybody. Correct. And now we're in a situation where everybody can get access to things in a greater and greater amount globally. And so things become less, material goods become far less of a store of value. And thus we're now again mentally and emotionally forced back into something that is a store of value, which would be the cryptocurrencies. And they're also appreciating over time, and they're going to benefit from hyperinflation. They have already done so, and they've already displaced bonds and traditional assets. That's why we see the traditional guys trying to create futures markets and get in any way they can. Their problem is they can't manipulate it. In order to get in, they've actually got to buy it, which of course drives the price up.
Do you think if cryptocurrencies had not been created, or if the protocol wasn't around, we would be in a much worse shape in this financial crisis? Because where would all this hyperinflation go? Eventually it would end up in food and everyday items.
Yeah, exactly. We would be, globally, we would be Venezuela.
Right. Makes sense.
Okay, sorry about that.
I was saying, when can we expect your next report? You just came out.
I've got a lot of work to do, physical work. I've got things that I must achieve. And so the next report is probably at least 40 days out. I've got the processing running now. The processing should get done about the first part of April. So technically I could probably get into it. It's just that I'm so busy trying to get the rest of my gear moved. I still have PCs from my office that I have not even refired up after the move, and these kind of things. So at least 40 days out.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to it. And thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Nice chatting with you.
I'll talk to you again soon.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Bye.